Sarah's hands shook as she stepped off the stagecoach into the blizzard, her carpet bag clutched against her chest like a shield. The crowd had gathered despite the snow, 20, maybe 30 faces pressed close, staring at the scars that twisted down the left side of her neck. She opened her mouth to greet them, to explain, to apologize for what she couldn't control. Nothing came out. It never did. Not since the fire. A woman in the front spat into the snow at Sarah's feet, and the whispers began like wolves circling wounded prey. Before we continue Sarah's journey, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far her story travels. And if you believe even the most broken hearts deserve a second chance, hit that subscribe button. Sarah's going to need all of us before this winter ends. The stage driver wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes as he handed down her bag. "Good luck, miss," he muttered, and the pity in his voice cut deeper than the December wind. Winter Creek, Colorado. Population 247, according to the faded sign half buried in snow. Sarah had memorized every detail from Harold Mackenzie's letters, the thriving cattle ranch, the respectable position in the community, the promise of a fresh start, far from the whispers that had followed her since Atlanta burned. What his letters hadn't mentioned was the cold. Not just the mountain winter that turned her breath to fog, but the cold in every face now studying her like she was something diseased. "That's her." A woman's voice sharp enough to crack ice. "That's what Harold ordered." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her throat, to the scars that roped from her left ear down past her collar. The burns had healed years ago, but they'd taken her voice with them. She'd explained this in her letters. Harold had written back that it didn't matter, that a quiet wife suited him just fine. Looking at the crowd's faces now, Sarah wondered if he'd told anyone else. She can't even say hello. Another woman younger with a baby on her hip and judgment in her eyes. What kind of wife can't speak? The cursed kind. This from an old man in a snow-dusted coat. "My grandmother knew a woman struck mute once. Witchcraft, they said. Or guilt too heavy for words." Sarah wanted to run. Wanted to climb back on that stage and ride until the mountains were just a memory. But Atlanta had nothing left for her. The asylum her brother-in-law had threatened was worse than any frontier town's cruelty. She'd chosen this. She'd survived this. "Where's Harold?" The stage driver's impatience cut through the murmurs. "I got a schedule to keep." "Coming?" A man pushed through the crowd. Not Harold, someone younger with a deputy's star on his coat. "Harold sent me. Said to bring her to the hotel until the ceremony tomorrow." He looked at Sarah with the same cautious distance he might give a strange dog. "I'm Deputy Mills. You can follow me, miss." Sarah nodded, gripping her bag tighter. The crowd parted slowly, grudgingly, their whispers following her like the snow. "Did you see her neck? Poor Harold, stuck with damaged goods. I heard she survived a fire. Only one who lived. That's suspicious, ain't it?" The hotel was a two-story structure that had seen better decades. Mrs. Calloway, the owner, was a thick-waisted woman with gray hair pulled so tight it made her eyes narrow. She took Sarah's money without warmth and handed her a key. "Room 4. Upstairs end of the hall." Her voice was clipped efficient. "Breakfast is at 6. Don't be late." Deputy Mills tipped his hat and left without another word. Sarah climbed the stairs alone, each step creaking under her weight. The hallway smelled of old smoke and older wood. Her room was barely bigger than a closet, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the main street, where the crowd was finally dispersing. She set her bag on the bed and sat beside it, still wearing her coat and hat. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices from the next room. "Can't believe Harold's going through with it. Man gets lonely out on that ranch. Can't blame him for wanting a woman. But that one, you see the way she looked, like something half-finished." Sarah closed her eyes, pressing her palm against her scars. The doctors in Atlanta had called her lucky. Third-degree burns should have killed her, they said. Should have taken more than just her voice. Instead, she'd walked out of that burning boarding house alive while 4 others didn't. The landlady's daughter. 2 traveling salesmen, the cook who'd tried to save them all. Sarah had been practicing her lines for the theater when the lamp fell. She'd been the only one on the ground floor, the only one who could run, the only one who survived. Guilt, the old man had said. Too heavy for words. Maybe he was right. A knock on the door jolted her from sleep. Sarah hadn't meant to doze, but exhaustion and the rocking of the stagecoach had caught up with her. Gray dawn light filtered through the frost on the window. "Miss Mitchell?" Mrs. Calloway's voice only slightly less sharp than yesterday. "Mr. Mackenzie is downstairs." Sarah's hands fumbled with her buttons as she stood. She'd slept in her dress, too tired to undress, too uncertain to fully settle in. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed dark circles under her eyes and hair escaping its pins. She did what she could, fingers clumsy with cold and nerves. Harold Mackenzie stood in the hotel dining room, like a man waiting for a business appointment. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that might have been handsome if it ever smiled. His clothes were expensive tailored wool suit, polished boots, a watch chain glinting at his vest. Money and respectability in every detail. He didn't stand when she entered. "Miss Mitchell." Not a question, not a greeting. Just a statement of fact. "Sit down. We need to talk." Sarah sat folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. Across the table, Harold studied her with the same expression she'd seen on her brother-in-law's face when he'd inventoried their mother's estate. Assessing value, finding it lacking. "I'm going to be direct." Harold's voice was quiet, controlled. "Your letters failed to mention the extent of your disfigurement." Sarah's throat worked uselessly. She reached for the small slate she kept in her pocket, but Harold held up a hand. "Don't bother with that. I can't have a wife who needs to write everything down. Looks ridiculous." He poured himself coffee from the pot Mrs. Calloway had left on the table. He didn't offer Sarah any. "The damage is done. You're here, the town knows I sent for a bride. Backing out now would make me look like a fool." He drank, grimaced, set the cup down with a click of china against wood. "So here's what's going to happen. We'll marry today as planned. You'll move to the ranch and handle the house. Cooking, cleaning, mending. You can do those things." Sarah nodded quickly. "Good. In return, you'll have a roof, food, and my name. That's more than a woman in your condition could expect elsewhere." He stood brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. "The circuit preacher is here today, headed north tomorrow. Ceremonies at noon in the church. Don't be late." He left without waiting for a response. Without asking if she agreed. Without any acknowledgement that he'd just outlined her entire future in less time than it took to drink a cup of coffee. Sarah sat very still, staring at the full pot on the table. Her hands shook worse now. She poured a cup just to have something to do and watched the liquid slosh over the rim because she couldn't control the tremor. "Bit of advice, dear." Sarah jumped. An older woman had appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, thin, silver-haired with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Not Mrs. Calloway. Someone else. "I'm Ruth Henderson. I run the dress shop across the street." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "I saw you arrive yesterday. Saw how the town treated you." Sarah set down the coffee cup, waiting. "Harold Mackenzie is not a kind man." Ruth's words were careful, measured. "His first wife, Margaret, she was a sweet girl, too sweet for him. When she died in childbirth 2 years back, some folks said it was a mercy. At least she didn't have to live with him anymore." The cold that spread through Sarah's chest had nothing to do with the winter. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah mouthed the words carefully, hoping Ruth could read lips. Ruth could. "Because women need to look out for each other in places like this, and because you should know what you're walking into." She glanced toward the front windows where morning light was starting to strengthen. "There's still time to leave. The southbound stage comes through at 10. Sarah thought of Atlanta, the asylum, her brother-in-law's threats. The way the theater company had let her go kindly apologetically, but let her go nonetheless, because an actress who couldn't speak was no actress at all. She shook her head. Ruth's expression didn't change. "Then at least promise me something. If it gets bad, and I mean truly bad, you come to me. My shop has a room in the back. You understand?" Sarah nodded, throat tight with gratitude she couldn't voice. "All right then." Ruth straightened her voice, returning to normal volume. "You'll need something better than that traveling dress for a wedding. Come across to the shop. I'll find you something appropriate." The dress was gray wool, high-necked and long-sleeved. Practical, modest. The kind of dress that said widow or governess or any other word that meant a woman who'd given up on joy. Ruth had alterations to make, so Sarah waited in the shop's back room, surrounded by bolts of fabric and the clean smell of new cloth. Through the front window, she could see the town waking up. A wagon passed loaded with hay. 2 men stood outside the general store, their breath fogging in the cold. A woman hurried by with a basket, her head down against the wind. Normal life. Ordinary morning. While Sarah prepared to marry a stranger who saw her as a bad bargain, he was stuck with. "You're making a mistake." Sarah turned. A young woman stood in the doorway, maybe 20, with dark hair and darker eyes, wearing a practical dress and a man's coat over it. "I'm Emma Wilson. My father runs the livery." She didn't smile. "I saw you yesterday. Heard what Harold said this morning too, Mrs. Calloway talks loud when she gossips." Sarah waited, unsure what else to do. "Harold Mackenzie is a bastard." Emma's bluntness was almost refreshing after Ruth's careful warnings. "He treated Margaret like property. Worked her half to death on that ranch, then blamed her when the baby came too early. She bled out while he was in town drinking, and he had the nerve to cry at her funeral." Sarah's hand found her throat again, the scars suddenly burning. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the truth." Emma stepped closer, her eyes fierce. "And because someone needs to say it straight. If you marry him, you'll regret it. He'll break you down piece by piece until there's nothing left. That's what he does." "But where else can I go?" Sarah wanted to scream. What else am I supposed to do? Instead, she just stood there silent, as always, while Emma shook her head. "I'm sorry. I can see you've got no other choice, and that's the real tragedy, isn't it? Women like us, we've got no choices, just different kinds of cages." Emma turned to leave, then paused. "My father's livery is on the north end of town. You ever need a horse saddled quiet like, you come find me. Day or night." She left before Sarah could respond. Not that Sarah had any response to give. Ruth returned with the altered dress, and Sarah changed in the back room. The mirror showed her a bride in name-only gray dress, scarred neck eyes that held no hope. This was what she'd become. This was what the fire had left. At 11:30, Ruth walked with her to the church. The building was small, white-painted wood, with a steeple that looked like it might blow over in a strong wind. Inside, the air was marginally warmer than outside, and the pews were mostly empty. Harold stood at the front with Deputy Mills and another man the preacher Sarah assumed in his dusty black suit and tired eyes. Mrs. Calloway sat in the front pew with her husband. Behind them, a scattering of curious townspeople who'd come to witness Winter Creek's most pitiful wedding. Sarah recognized the woman with the baby from yesterday, the old man who'd mentioned witchcraft, and a few others whose names she didn't know and probably never would. No one smiled. No one welcomed her. They just watched with the same morbid interest they might give a hanging. Ruth squeezed Sarah's hand once, then took a seat. Sarah walked alone down the short aisle, her footsteps loud in the silence. Harold didn't turn to watch her approach. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight like a man enduring an unpleasant but necessary task. The preacher opened his Bible with hands that shook slightly. He was old, Sarah realized. Old and tired, and probably asked to perform this ceremony as a favor to Harold, who had money and influence in Winter Creek. "Dearly beloved," The preacher began, his voice surprisingly strong. "We are gathered here today." The church door slammed open. Everyone turned. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, snow swirling around his boots. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy coat and worn hat. For a moment Sarah thought it was someone coming to object to stop this farce of a wedding. Then the man stepped inside, and she saw his face. Not handsome in any conventional way. His face was too weathered, too marked by sun and wind and years of outdoor work. His nose had been broken at least once. A scar cut through his left eyebrow. He looked like he'd lived hard and expected to keep living that way. But his eyes, gray as the winter sky, held something Sarah hadn't seen in weeks. Kindness. "Sorry I'm late." His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. "Horse threw a shoe on the ridge trail." "Ethan." Harold's voice was cold. "What are you doing here?" "You invited me. Last week at the Cattlemen's Association meeting. Said you were getting married, wanted witnesses." "That was before—" Harold stopped himself, jaw working. "I didn't think you'd actually come." "I gave my word." The man Ethan removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that needed cutting. Snow melted on his shoulders. His eyes found Sarah's, held them for a moment. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or concern. Then he looked away, taking a seat in the back pew. The preacher cleared his throat. "Shall we continue?" Harold nodded curtly. The ceremony resumed. Sarah heard maybe half the words. The rest disappeared into the roaring in her ears, the pounding of her heart, the sick certainty that she was making a terrible mistake but didn't know how to stop it. "Do you, Harold James Mackenzie, take this woman?" "I do." Flat. Emotionless. "And do you, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, take this man?" Sarah looked at Harold, at his cold eyes and colder expression. At the future, he represented a house on an isolated ranch, days of silence broken only by orders, nights of lying awake, wondering if this was all her life would ever be. She thought of Emma's warning, Ruth's offer of sanctuary, the southbound stage that was probably leaving town right about now. She thought of the asylum in Atlanta. Her mouth shaped the words, "I do." The preacher smiled, relieved. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Harold turned to her. Sarah saw the calculation in his eyes, wondering if he could skip this part if anyone would object. Then he leaned in, pressed his lips to hers for exactly 1 second, and pulled back like he'd been forced to kiss something dead. "Congratulations," the preacher said, but nobody cheered. Harold signed the marriage certificate with harsh strokes. Sarah took the pen with shaking hands, managing her signature despite the tremor. There, legal now, binding, no escape. "We'll head to the ranch." Harold was already moving toward the door. "I've got work this afternoon. You can settle into the house." Sarah followed her gray dress, whispering against the wooden floor. As she passed the back pew, she felt eyes on her. Ethan was watching, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he gave the slightest nod. It might have been sympathy. It might have been acknowledgement. Either way, it was the first human warmth Sarah had felt since stepping off that stagecoach. Then she was outside in the cold, climbing into Harold's wagon, leaving Winter Creek behind for a ranch house she'd never seen, and a marriage that already felt like a prison. The ceremony had taken 15 minutes. Sarah's entire future had been decided in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee and sign a piece of paper. As the wagon rolled north through the snow, she pressed her hand against her scars and wondered if the fire that took her voice had really been the worst thing that ever happened to her, or if the worst was just beginning. 2. The ranch appeared through the snow like something from a cautionary tale. A 2-story house that might have been grand once before the paint peeled and the shutters went crooked and the whole structure sagged into its foundation. Outbuildings clustered around it like chicks around a dying hen, a barn that needed new boards, a chicken coop listing sideways, a smokehouse with a door hanging by one hinge. Harold pulled the wagon up to the front porch without comment. without pride or apology or any acknowledgement that this was Sarah's new home. "Bring your bag. I'll show you the house." Inside was colder than outside. No fire in the stove, no warmth anywhere. The front room held a sofa with stuffing coming out of one arm, a table with 3 chairs and walls that had once been papered but now showed more water stains than pattern. "Kitchen's through there," Harold pointed. "Your room's upstairs, second door. Mine's the first. Don't confuse them." Separate rooms. Sarah felt relief so sharp it was almost painful. Harold moved through the house like he was conducting a business inventory. "Stove's temperamental. Needs kindling before the wood or it smokes. Wells out back haul your water in the morning for the day. Chickens need feeding at dawn and dusk. Root cellars under the kitchen stocked for winter, but running low on preserves. You'll need to can more come summer." Summer. The word felt impossible. Sarah couldn't imagine living here until next week, let alone months from now. "I'll be working most days until sundown. Sometimes later, if there's cattle trouble." Harold stopped at the base of the stairs. "I expect hot meals at 6 in the morning and 6 at night. House kept clean, mending done regular. You understand?" Sarah nodded. "Good. I'm going out to check the herd. Get yourself settled." He pulled his coat tighter. "And Sarah." She looked up. "Don't embarrass me in town. Don't let people think I married wrong. You might be damaged, but you're a Mackenzie now. Act like it." He left. The door slammed behind him, rattling the windows. Sarah stood in the cold house and tried not to cry. Her room was barely furnished. A bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a chair by the window. Someone had left an old quilt on the bed, faded but clean. Margaret's probably, the first wife who'd died here. Sarah unpacked her carpet bag slowly, placing each item with careful precision. 2 dresses, a nightgown, her mother's Bible, the small slate and chalk, a locket with photographs of her parents dead 10 years now from fever. Everything she owned in the world fit in one drawer. She sat on the bed, still wearing her gray wedding dress, and looked out the window. Snow covered everything, the yard, the outbuildings, the mountains beyond. Beautiful and deadly. A person could freeze to death out there, and nobody would find them until spring thaw. A person could disappear. Downstairs, the house creaked and settled. Wind found gaps in the walls, whistling through with breath-cold promises. Sarah wrapped herself in Margaret's quilt and tried to remember the last time she'd felt warm. Atlanta. Before the fire. When she had a voice and a future and dreams that didn't taste like ash. That Sarah was gone. Dead as the people she'd failed to save. This Sarah, scarred, silent, trapped, was all that remained. She must have fallen asleep, because the sound of the door slamming jolted her awake. Darkness had fallen. Her room was freezing, her breath visible in the air. "Sarah?" Harold's voice sharp with irritation. "Where's my supper?" She scrambled up, joints stiff from cold and poor sleep. No time to change clothes. She hurried downstairs in her wedding dress, wrinkled now and smelling of travel. Harold stood in the kitchen, his face dark with anger. "It's past 6. I told you to have meals ready." Sarah's hands moved frantically. Apology, explanation, confusion, but sign language meant nothing to a man who wouldn't look. "I don't want excuses." Harold moved closer, and Sarah instinctively stepped back. "I gave you simple instructions. Hot meal at 6. It's not complicated even for someone like you." Someone like you. Damaged. Broken. Less than. Sarah pointed to the cold stove, the empty pantry shelves visible through the open door. She hadn't known where anything was kept, hadn't been shown, hadn't been given time to learn. "That's your job to figure out." Harold's voice was ice. "You're the wife. You're supposed to know how to run a household. That's the only reason I married you." He turned away, dismissing her. "I'll eat in town. Don't wait up." The door slammed again. Hoofbeats faded into the distance. Sarah stood alone in the dark kitchen and finally let herself cry. She figured out the stove by trial and error, burning her hand twice before getting the kindling to catch. The pantry yielded flour lard, some tired-looking potatoes. She made biscuits and fried potatoes, eating standing up at the counter because sitting at the table alone felt too much like admitting defeat. The food tasted like nothing. After washing up, Sarah explored the house by lamplight. The parlor held more of Margaret's ghost. A sewing basket with thread still in it. A book left open on the side table. Flowers dried and dead in a vase nobody had emptied. Had Margaret been happy here? Had she loved Harold? Or had she too been a mail-order bride with nowhere else to go? Had she known in those final moments, as she bled out, that she was lucky to escape, Sarah climbed the stairs to her cold room and undressed in the dark. The nightgown was thin, meant for warmer climates. She piled every blanket she could find on the bed and burrowed beneath them, but the cold still crept in. Outside, wind howled across the prairie. Inside, the house groaned and settled like a living thing in pain. Sarah pressed her scarred throat and tried to remember songs she used to sing. Lullabies her mother taught her, hymns from church. The aria she'd been practicing when the lamp fell and her whole world burned. No sound came. It never did. But in her head, the music still played. In her head, she could still scream. She just had to make sure the screaming stayed inside, because there was nobody out here who would hear it. Nobody who would care. Sarah Mackenzie, née Mitchell, had made her choice. Now she would live with it, or die trying. The first week passed like a sentence being served. Sarah learned the ranch's rhythms through trial and bitter error, how the stove smoked if she didn't clean the flue daily, how the chickens scattered if she moved too fast, how the well rope had a trick to it that left her hands raw and bleeding before she figured it out. Harold watched her failures with cold satisfaction, as if each mistake proved something he'd already decided about her worth. Margaret never burned the bacon, he said on the fourth morning, pushing his plate away. Margaret kept the house warm. Margaret knew how to be a proper wife. Sarah's hands tightened on the skillet handle. She wanted to throw it at his head, wanted to scream that Margaret had probably learned these things over time, that Sarah had been here less than a week, that maybe if he'd shown her anything instead of just criticizing. But wanting meant nothing when you had no voice. Harold left for the range and Sarah scraped the burned bacon into the slop bucket for the pigs. Through the kitchen window, she watched him ride north toward the tree line, his back straight and unforgiving. When he disappeared, the tension in her shoulders finally eased. She was washing dishes when she heard hoofbeats. Her stomach dropped. Harold must have forgotten something, and she'd get another lecture about whatever she'd done wrong now. But when she looked out, it wasn't Harold's bay gelding. It was a rangy buckskin, with a rider who sat easy in the saddle despite the cold. Ethan, the man from the wedding. Sarah dried her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch uncertain. Men didn't just ride up to another man's ranch without cause, especially not to visit a woman alone. Ethan dismounted, looping his reins over the porch rail. Up close in daylight, Sarah could see more of him. The gray in his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, the way his coat was patched but clean. He held his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Mackenzie." His voice was quiet, respectful. "I hope I'm not intruding. I brought something for you." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. When he handed it to her, Sarah felt weight and warmth through the fabric. "Fresh bread from my place. And some venison from yesterday's hunt. Figured you might not have much laid by yet, being new to the ranch and all." Sarah stared at the bundle, then at him. Kindness was so unexpected it felt like a trick. What did he want? What would this cost? Ethan seemed to read her suspicion. "No strings attached, ma'am. I just remember what it's like to be new somewhere trying to figure things out with nobody to help. My wife. She passed 6 years back. She always said neighbors ought to look after each other, especially out here where we're all so spread thin." His wife. Dead 6 years. The way he said it, simple and direct, no wallowing, told Sarah he'd made peace with grief the way a person makes peace with scars. You carried it, but it didn't own you anymore." She nodded slowly, accepting the bundle. The bread was still warm. "I should get going. Don't want to cause talk." Ethan put his hat back on. "But, Mrs. Mackenzie, if you ever need anything, wood chopped, well rope fixed, anything like that, my place is just over the ridge to the west. Follow the creek upstream about 3 miles. Can't miss it." He swung back into the saddle with the grace of long practice. Sarah watched him go, still holding the warm bread, still trying to understand why anyone would be kind without expecting payment. That night, she served Harold venison stew with fresh bread. He ate without comment, but she noticed he took a second helping. Small victories counted for something, even if they came wrapped in another man's generosity. The second week winter tightened its grip. Snow fell for 3 days straight, trapping Sarah in the house with Harold's cold silences and colder criticisms. The isolation pressed against her like a physical weight. She'd thought Atlanta was lonely, being the only voiceless actress in a company of people who made their living with words. But at least there had been people. Movement. The illusion of belonging, even if it was false. Here there was nothing but white silence, and Harold's contempt. On the 4th day, when the snow finally stopped, Sarah bundled herself in every layer she owned and went to feed the chickens. The cold bit through her clothes like teeth, but she didn't care. She needed to be outside, needed to see something besides the walls that were starting to feel like a tomb. She was scattering grain when she heard voices. Male voices rough with laughter coming from the barn. "You really married that creature, Harold. What were you thinking?" "Wasn't thinking with his head, if you know what I mean." More laughter. Sarah froze the grain bucket heavy in her numb hands. "She's uglier than a mud fence. That scar on her neck, Jesus. Looks like someone tried to cut her throat and gave up halfway. I heard she can't speak because she's cursed. My ma said silent women are marked by the devil. Your ma says everything's marked by the devil, Tom. Still, it ain't natural. And Harold taking her in like that makes a man wonder what he was desperate for." Harold's voice when it came was tight with barely controlled anger. "My affairs are my own business. I suggest you boys focus on your work and leave my wife out of your mouths." "Aw, don't be sore. We're just joshing." "Josh on your own time. Those fences won't ride themselves." Hoofbeats faded. Sarah stood in the snow grain spilling from her shaking hands. She'd known the town thought poorly of her, but hearing it, the casual cruelty, the easy mockery cut deeper than she'd expected. And Harold. He'd defended her, but not out of love or loyalty. Out of wounded pride, because their ridicule reflected poorly on him. She wasn't his wife. She was his property. And nobody insulted a man's property without consequence. That night, Sarah lay awake in her cold room and thought about Emma's offer. A horse saddled quiet like day or night. Where would she even go? She had no money, no prospects, no voice to plead her case anywhere. The asylum in Atlanta seemed more certain with every passing day. Unless she could find work, unless someone would take a chance on a mute woman with scars and a past full of fire. Unless. The words were as empty as her future. The 3rd week brought a thaw brief and treacherous. Ice melted during the day and refroze at night, making the ground a death trap. Sarah slipped twice, hauling water, bruising her hip and her pride. Harold didn't notice or didn't care. But someone did. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house sheets, frozen stiff within minutes of leaving the basket, when Ethan rode up again. This time, he had a pack horse loaded with cut firewood. "Thought you might be running low." He started unloading without waiting for permission. Harold keeps meaning to split more, but the cattle keep him busy. Sarah gestured helplessly, gratitude, confusion, the question of why he kept helping. Ethan stacked wood with efficient movements, his breath fogging in the cold. "My place is smaller, just me to keep warm. I split more than I need most years. Rather see it used than wasted." He finished stacking and turned to face her directly. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I know it's not my place to say anything, but you look like you could use a friend out here. And before you worry about propriety or what people might think, I'm not offering anything improper, just neighborly concern. Sarah's throat worked trying to form words that wouldn't come. Ethan waited patient as stone. Finally, she pulled out her slate and chalk. The words came slowly, her cold fingers clumsy. Why are you kind to me? Ethan read it, and something shifted in his face. Not pity, something deeper. Because I know what it's like to be alone in a place that doesn't want you. Because my wife taught me that kindness costs nothing but means everything. And because... He paused, choosing words carefully. Because I was at that wedding. I saw your face when you said I do. And I've seen enough trapped animals in my life to recognize one when I see it. Sarah's eyes burned. She blinked hard, refusing to cry in front of this strange, kind man. Thank you, she wrote. Don't thank me yet. I haven't done anything worth thanking. Ethan gathered his reins. But Mrs. Mackenzie, if things get bad here, and I mean truly bad, you remember what I said about my place being over the ridge, 3 miles upstream, doors always open. He rode away before Sarah could respond, leaving her standing in the frozen yard with a slate full of words she couldn't speak, and a woodpile that would last through the worst of winter. That night, Harold came home drunk. Not falling down drunk, but mean drunk. The kind that made his words sharp and his movements unpredictable. Saw Ethan Carter today in town. He threw his coat at the hook and missed. He mentioned stopping by here. Sarah's hands went still on the dishes she was washing. She nodded carefully. He bring firewood. Another nod. Harold's laugh was ugly. Isn't that generous? Ethan Carter playing Good Samaritan. You know what people in town are saying? They're saying he's taken an interest in my wife. That maybe you two are... He made a crude gesture. Sarah spun around, shaking her head violently. Her hands moved fast denial explanation. But Harold wasn't watching. Don't bother with that nonsense. I know you can't speak. Convenient, isn't it? Can't defend yourself, can't explain, can't do anything but stand there like a dumb animal. He moved closer, and Sarah smelled whiskey thick on his breath. Maybe that's what Ethan likes. A woman who can't talk back, can't refuse him. Sarah's back hit the counter. Harold was between her and the door. His face twisted with something dark, not jealousy exactly, but wounded pride again. Someone else paying attention to what was his. Let me make something clear, Sarah. You're my wife, mine. I don't care if you're broken or cursed or whatever the hell made you this way. You belong to me, and what's mine stays mine. Understand? She nodded, heart hammering. Good. Now finish those dishes and get out of my sight. He stumbled toward the parlor, toward the bottle she knew he kept in the desk drawer. Sarah's hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to pick up the plate she'd dropped. Later, lying in her cold bed, she thought about Ruth Henderson's offer. A room in the back of the dress shop. Sanctuary. But going there meant admitting defeat. Meant confirming every cruel thing Harold and the town believed about her, that she was weak, damaged, incapable of being a proper wife. Pride was a cold comfort, but it was all Sarah had left. Sunday came, and with it the expectation that Sarah would attend church. Harold made it clear this wasn't optional. The whole town already thinks I married a freak. At least show them you can act civilized for an hour. Sarah wore her gray dress, the only one decent enough for church, and sat beside Harold in the wagon as they drove into Winter Creek. The streets were busy with Sunday morning traffic families heading to worship, children bundled against the cold. Inside the church, eyes followed Sarah like weapons. She felt every stare heard, every whisper, even though most people had the decency to wait until they thought she couldn't see them. Harold led her to a pew near the front, his regular spot, she assumed. The wood was hard and cold beneath her. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to make herself small. The preacher from their wedding stood at the pulpit, older and more tired than Sarah remembered. His sermon was about charity, about loving thy neighbor, about the Good Samaritan who stopped to help when others passed by. Sarah wondered if he saw the irony. If anyone in this congregation would stop to help her if she was bleeding on the side of the road. Or if they'd hurry past crossing themselves and muttering about curses. Halfway through the sermon, the church door opened. Cold air swept in, and everyone turned to see who was late. Ethan Carter stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his Sunday clothes worn but respectable. He nodded apologetically to the preacher and slipped into a back pew. Sarah felt Harold stiffen beside her. His hand found her wrist, gripping tight enough to hurt. "Don't even look at him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't give these vultures anything more to talk about." Sarah kept her eyes forward, but she felt Ethan's presence like warmth in a cold room, knowing someone kind was nearby even if she couldn't acknowledge it. After the service, the congregation lingered outside despite the cold. Women clustered in groups, men stood talking business and weather. Sarah stood beside Harold like a piece of furniture included, but not participating. "Harold, good to see you." A portly man approached, extending his hand. "How's the new bride settling in?" "Well enough, Martin. Thank you for asking." "Glad to hear it. We were all worried after Margaret, you know. Terrible tragedy." Martin's eyes slid to Sarah, then away like looking too long might contaminate him. "This one looks hardier at least. Built for ranch work." Built for ranch work. Like a horse or an ox. Sarah's learning. Harold's voice was tight. "It takes time." Of course. Martin clapped Harold on the shoulder. "Well, you let us know if you need anything. Annie's always happy to help teach a new bride the ropes. Though I suppose teaching might be difficult when—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at his throat. "We manage." Harold's hand tightened on Sarah's arm. "If you'll excuse us, we need to get back. Afternoon chores won't wait." They turned toward the wagon, but a voice stopped them. "Mrs. Mackenzie." Sarah turned. Ruth Henderson stood a few feet away, wrapped in a practical wool coat, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I wanted to invite you to the Ladies' Aid Society meeting this Wednesday. We gather at the church to sew for the poor and discuss community matters. New wives are always welcome." Sarah's eyes darted to Harold. He looked like he'd bitten into something sour. "That's kind of you, Ruth, but Sarah's needed at the ranch. Lots of work to be done. I'm sure she could spare a few hours. The meeting's from 1 to 4, plenty of time for her to get back before supper." Ruth's smile was pleasant, but her tone left no room for argument. "We'd so love to have her, get to know her better." Harold's jaw worked. Refusing would look bad, would confirm that he was keeping Sarah isolated. But agreeing meant losing control, meant Sarah might say something, or rather write something that would embarrass him. "Fine, Wednesday. But she'll need to be home by 4:30. "Of course." Ruth turned to Sarah. "We'll see you Wednesday, dear. Come to the church side entrance. We meet in the basement room." Sarah nodded, something like hope flickering in her chest. A few hours away from the ranch. Women who might talk to her instead of about her. The possibility of connection, however fragile. On the ride home, Harold was silent until they were out of sight of town. Then, "That woman's a meddler. Always has been. Thinks running a dress shop gives her the right to poke into everyone's business." Sarah said nothing because she couldn't, and because she'd learned that Harold's monologues didn't require responses. "You'll go Wednesday because I said you could. But Sarah, hear me clearly. You don't talk about our marriage. You don't write anything that makes me look bad. You smile and nod and sew whatever they're sewing, and then you come straight home. Understood?" Sarah nodded, but inside she was calculating. Wednesday to Wednesday, 7 days away. 7 days of Harold's cold contempt and colder house. 7 days of wondering if the Ladies' Aid Society would treat her like a curiosity or a human being. 7 days of survival. She could manage that. She'd managed worse. Monday brought more snow and another visit from Ethan. This time, he brought a hen, a good layer, he said, to supplement Harold's aging flock, and a jar of honey from his own hives. "Found these on your porch step." He handed Sarah a pair of work gloves, sturdy leather lined with wool. Figured your hands could use some protection. Well, rope's unforgiving without gloves. Sarah's throat tightened. She took the gloves, running her fingers over the careful stitching. Someone Ethan probably had made these, had noticed her bleeding hands and done something about it. She pulled out her slate. I can't pay you for all this. Don't want payment. Just want to help. Ethan shifted his weight, suddenly awkward. Mrs. Mackenzie, I hope I'm not overstepping. But if I am, you tell me and I'll stop coming around. Last thing I want is to make your situation harder. Sarah wrote quickly. You make it better. She saw the moment the words registered, saw something warm cross his weathered face. Not attraction, nothing improper. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd done something good. All right then. I'll keep stopping by when I'm in the area. Maybe bring some books next time if you're a reader. Gets lonely out here with nothing but your own thoughts for company. I love reading, Sarah wrote. Good. I've got plenty to spare. My wife collected them novels, mostly some poetry. Haven't been able to bring myself to part with them, but she'd have wanted them read. He paused. She was a lot like you, actually. Quiet. Thoughtful. Saw things other people missed. Sarah wanted to ask how she died, what she was like, whether Ethan had loved her the way he spoke about her with gentle reverence and no bitterness. But those questions felt too intimate for a ranch yard in the cold. Instead, she wrote, Thank you for being kind. Kindness ought to be the baseline, not something worth thanking. Ethan gathered his reins. See you soon, Mrs. Mackenzie. Stay warm. After he left, Sarah stood in the yard wearing her new gloves, holding a jar of golden honey, and feeling something she'd almost forgotten. Not happiness exactly, but the possibility of it. The sense that maybe somewhere in this frozen wasteland, there were people who saw her as more than damaged goods. That night, Harold noticed the gloves. Where'd those come from? Sarah pointed west toward Ethan's ranch. He give you anything else? Harold's voice was dangerous quiet. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Lying would only make things worse when he found the hen or the honey. That man's got no business giving my wife gifts. People will talk. He's just being neighborly. Sarah wrote on her ever-present slate. Neighborly. Harold spat the word like a curse. That what they're calling it now, a man doesn't bring a woman gifts unless he wants something. And Ethan Carter's no saint no matter what people think. Sarah wanted to defend Ethan, wanted to point out that he'd shown her more kindness in 3 weeks than Harold had since the wedding. But defending another man would only confirm Harold's suspicions. From now on, when Carter shows up, you tell him thanks, but no thanks. We don't need his charity. We don't need anything from anybody. Clear. Sarah nodded, but her hands clenched in the new gloves. Harold could forbid her from accepting gifts, but he couldn't forbid Ethan from being decent. And she wouldn't give up that tiny bright spot in her dark existence, no matter what Harold demanded. That was the first time Sarah consciously chose to disobey her husband. It felt like rebellion and freedom and terror, all at once. Wednesday arrived with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to freeze breath. Harold drove Sarah into town in the wagon, his silence heavy as the frost. 4:30, he said, dropping her at the church. Not a minute later, or you'll walk home. He drove off toward the saloon, and Sarah descended the church steps to the basement entrance. Voices drifted up, women's voices, warm and busy. She knocked softly. Ruth opened the door, her face breaking into a genuine smile. Sarah? Come in, come in. We're just getting started. The basement room was warm, heated by a large stove in the corner. A dozen women sat in a circle, quilting frames and sewing baskets spread around them. Sarah recognized Mrs. Calloway from the hotel, Emma from the livery, and several others whose names she'd never learned. Everyone, this is Sarah Mackenzie. Let's make her feel welcome. The women murmured greetings, some warmer than others. Mrs. Calloway's smile was thin and didn't reach her eyes. But Emma pushed a chair forward, making space. Sit here. We're patching quilts for the winter charity drive. Ever done quilting? Sarah nodded, grateful for a task that required hands instead of words. Good. Here's a section that needs work. Ruth handed her a quilt square thread and a needle. Just do your best. We're not looking for perfection. For the first hour, Sarah sewed while the women talked around her. Town gossip mostly, who was courting whom, which families were struggling, how the harsh winter was affecting everyone. Sarah kept her head down and her stitches small, grateful to be included, even peripherally. Then Mrs. Calloway said, "So Sarah, how are you settling in at the Mackenzie Ranch? Must be quite different from where you came from." Every head turned. Sarah's hands stilled on her sewing. Ruth interceded smoothly. "Mrs. Calloway, you know Sarah can't speak. Perhaps we could frame questions she can answer with a nod or shake of her head." "Oh, of course. How thoughtless of me." Mrs. Calloway's tone suggested she wasn't thoughtless at all. "Is it true you survived a fire? That's how you got those scars?" Sarah nodded slowly, feeling heat creep up her neck. "And the fire killed other people, but not you." Another nod, more reluctant. "How strange. I've always thought it peculiar when one person survives and others don't. Makes you wonder about providence, or guilt." "Clara." Ruth's voice was sharp. "That's enough. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. It's odd, that's all. A fire that takes her voice, but leaves her alive. Some might call that suspicious." Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Some might call you a vicious gossip who ought to keep her mouth shut. Sarah's been through enough without you implying she's a murderer." "I implied no such thing. You merely nothing. Everyone in this room heard exactly what you were suggesting." Emma turned to Sarah. "Don't listen to her. Half this town's got more venom than sense." Sarah's hands shook as she tried to thread her needle. The room felt too small, too hot, the walls pressing in like the smoke that had stolen her voice. Ruth stood taking control. "Clara, I think perhaps you should leave. This is meant to be a welcoming space, and you've made our guest uncomfortable." "Well, I never." "No, you never do think before you speak. Do you please go?" Mrs. Calloway gathered her things with offended dignity and swept out, slamming the door behind her. In the silence that followed, Sarah kept her eyes on her sewing, tears threatening. She'd been foolish to hope. Foolish to think these women would be any different from the rest of Winter Creek. "I'm sorry." Ruth's hand touched Sarah's shoulder. "Clara Calloway has always been cruel. Please don't judge us all by her standard." "Most of us don't care about gossip," Emma added. "We just want to know if you're all right out there. Harold's not—" She stopped herself. "We want to make sure you're safe." Sarah looked up, surprised by the genuine concern in Emma's face. Around the circle, other women nodded. Not all of them. Some looked uncomfortable, uncertain. But enough. Enough to matter. Sarah pulled out her slate and wrote carefully, "Thank you for defending me." "That's what women do," Emma said firmly. "We look out for each other because nobody else will." The afternoon continued more peacefully. The women taught Sarah their patterns, shared recipes, talked about spring planting and summer plans. Sarah soaked it in like warmth after months of cold. At 4:15, Ruth walked Sarah to the door. "Same time next week." Sarah nodded gratefully. "Good. And Sarah, if you ever need anything at all, you know where my shop is, day or night." The same offer Emma had made. The same offer Ethan had made. A network of safety forming around her, fragile as spring ice, but there nonetheless. Harold was waiting in the wagon, his face dark with impatience. Sarah climbed up without meeting his eyes. "You're late." She wasn't, but arguing was pointless. "What did you tell them? What did you write?" "Nothing bad." Sarah wrote, "Just sewing." "Better have been. I hear you've been making me look bad. There'll be consequences." Sarah tucked her slate away and stared at the frozen road ahead. Consequences. The word Harold used for everything from burned bacon to breathing wrong. Her whole life had become an exercise in avoiding consequences that came no matter what she did. But she'd had 3 hours away from him. 3 hours of women's company and careful kindness. 3 hours of feeling almost human. She'd take the consequences if it meant having that again. Back at the ranch, Sarah made supper while Harold reviewed his account books. The silence was heavy, but she'd grown used to it. Silence was better than Harold's voice. After he'd eaten and retreated to the parlor with his whiskey, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her slate and chalk. She wrote without purpose, just to see words form, to remember she could communicate even without sound. My name is Sarah Mackenzie. I am 26 years old. I survived a fire that killed 4 people. I did not start it. I am not cursed. I am not guilty. I am just trying to survive. She stared at the words until they blurred. Then she erased them carefully, leaving no trace. Some truths were too dangerous to leave written down. Some truths had to stay locked in a silent throat where they couldn't be used as weapons. Outside wind howled across the prairie, and somewhere in the darkness, a wolf answered with a howl of its own. Sarah blew out the lamp and climbed the stairs to her cold room, carrying loneliness like a stone in her chest, and hope, like a candle flame, she had to cup carefully to keep from dying. Tomorrow would bring more of the same Harold's contempt, the ranch's endless work, the isolation that pressed against her like a living thing. But next Wednesday, she'd have the Ladies' Aid Society again. And Ethan would probably stop by with more kindness she didn't deserve, but desperately needed. And Ruth's offer of sanctuary remained a door she could walk through if the walls finally closed in completely. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in Atlanta, more than she'd expected when she stepped off that stagecoach into the snow and hostile stares. She could survive on scraps of kindness and stolen moments of warmth. She'd survived worse with less. And survival, Sarah was learning, was its own kind of victory. The temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight, and Sarah woke to find ice crystals flowering across the inside of her bedroom window. Her breath came out in clouds as she dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, layering every piece of clothing she owned. Downstairs, the stove had gone cold. Harold would blame her for that too somehow. She was coaxing the kindling to catch when she heard his footsteps on the stairs, heavier than usual. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face was flushed, his eyes glassy with fever. "Coffee," he said, his voice rough. "Need to ride out to the north pasture. Fence is down." Sarah pointed at him, then at the chair, shaking her head firmly. Even she could see he was in no condition to ride anywhere. "Don't tell me what to do." Harold swayed slightly. "I've got cattle scattered from here to the ridge. Can't afford to lose stock because I'm feeling poorly." He made it 3 steps toward the door before his legs buckled. Sarah caught him by pure instinct, her small frame struggling under his weight as she guided him to a chair. His skin burned like the stove she'd been trying to light. "I'm fine," Harold insisted, but his hands shook when he tried to push her away. "Just need coffee, and I'll be fine." Sarah grabbed her slate. "You have a fever. You need rest." "I need to fix that goddamn fence." He tried to stand and nearly fell. This time, Sarah pushed him back down with both hands, surprising herself with the force of it. Their eyes met. For a moment, Sarah saw something in his face besides contempt, confusion maybe, or the realization that he needed help from the woman he'd spent 6 weeks treating like a servant. "Fine." The word came out defeated. "But someone's got to check that fence. Those cattle drift any further and rustlers'll have them before nightfall." Sarah was already writing, "I'll go." Harold's laugh was bitter and short. You've never ridden fence line in your life. You'd freeze before you made it halfway. Then tell me what to do." "Sarah, you can't even—" He stopped, pressed his hand to his forehead. When he looked at her again, the fever had stripped away some of his armor. "The north pasture is 4 miles out. You follow the tree line until you hit the creek, then head west. Fence runs along the ridge. You'll know the break when you see it, probably where the cottonwood fell in that last storm." Sarah nodded, already mentally cataloging what she'd need. Harold continued, his voice weakening. "There's wire and posts in the barn, tools in the leather bag hanging by the door. You'll need Christ, you'll need gloves, and—" He closed his eyes. "You're going to freeze out there." "I have gloves," Sarah wrote, thinking of Ethan's gift. "Take my heavy coat too, and the rifle, not for the fence, for protection. Wolves have been spotted near the North Range." Sarah felt ice that had nothing to do with temperature spread through her chest. Wolves. 4 miles of frozen wasteland. Fence repair she'd never done. But if she didn't go, Harold would try, and he'd likely collapse in the snow and freeze to death. She wasn't sure how she felt about that possibility. But leaving a man to die, even one who'd treated her cruelly, wasn't something she could do. She wrote, "I'll manage." Harold studied her for a long moment. "Why are you helping me? I haven't exactly been kind." Sarah looked at him. This man who'd called her damaged and cursed, and worse, who'd married her out of desperation and treated her like property, who'd never once asked what she needed or wanted or felt. She could write the truth, because kindness shouldn't be conditional because she'd survived by being stronger than the people who hurt her, because somewhere under his bitterness was a man drowning in grief for a wife he'd loved and lost. Instead, she just wrote, "Because I'm your wife." Something flickered across Harold's face. Shame maybe, or regret. But the fever took him. Then his eyes rolling back as he slumped in the chair. Sarah caught him again, managing to keep his head from hitting the table. His skin burned against her palms. She got him upstairs to his room, half dragging, half carrying, using strength she didn't know she had. Got him into bed with his clothes still on because undressing him felt too intimate, too much like caring. Brought water and cloths to cool the fever. Harold muttered in his delirium words Sarah couldn't quite catch. Margaret's name more than once. Apologies that might have been for his first wife or his current one or himself. Sarah left him sleeping fitfully and went to prepare for the longest ride of her life. The barn was dark and smelled of hay and horse and cold. Harold's gelding eyed her suspiciously when she approached with the saddle. She'd ridden before as a girl in Georgia, before the fire, before everything. But it had been years, and never in winter, never alone, never with this kind of purpose. "Easy," she murmured, then stopped. Her voice, unused for so long, came out as barely a whisper. The horse's ears flicked toward the sound, surprised. Sarah tried again. "Easy, boy." Stronger this time, though still rough as gravel. The words felt strange in her mouth, foreign after months of silence. But the horse calmed, letting her tighten the girth and adjust the stirrups. She loaded the saddlebags with wire and tools strapped on Harold's heavy coat that hung past her knees and lifted the rifle from its place by the door. The weight of it was unfamiliar, but solid. Protection against wolves and whatever else the frozen prairie held. The ride north was brutal. Wind cut through even Harold's thick coat, and snow blown from the trees stung her face like thrown sand. The horse picked its way carefully through drifts that came up to its chest in places. Sarah's hands ached even in the gloves, and her face went numb after the first mile. She found the tree line and followed it, watching for the creek Harold had mentioned. Her mind wandered to dangerous places. What if she got lost? What if the horse went lame? What if she couldn't find the brake, or couldn't fix it if she did? What if Harold died while she was gone, and she came back to a corpse in a cold house alone with no proof that she'd tried to help him, just a dead husband, and a town ready to believe the worst? The creek appeared like a silver thread against white snow. Sarah turned west, and the wind hit her full in the face. She ducked her head and kept riding. She almost missed the fence break. The fallen cottonwood was massive, its weight having snapped the wire and pulled 3 posts clean out of the frozen ground. Cattle tracks led away into the distance. Harold's stock scattered and vulnerable, just like he'd said. Sarah dismounted, her legs stiff and clumsy. She tied the horse to a tree and surveyed the damage with growing dread. This wasn't a simple fix. This was hours of work in killing cold, and the sun was already starting its descent toward the mountains. She pulled out the tools, her fingers fumbling with cold. The wire cutters, the post digger, the hammer. Everything felt too heavy, too complicated. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't do this. She wasn't strong enough, skilled enough, prepared enough. Then she thought of Harold's fever, of Ruth's offer of sanctuary, of the wolf howls she'd heard last night. She thought of every person who'd called her cursed or damaged or useless. Every face that had looked at her scars and decided she was less than human. Sarah picked up the post digger and attacked the frozen ground with fury she didn't know she possessed. The work was agony. The ground fought her with every strike. Her shoulders screamed. Her hands, even protected, developed blisters that broke and bled inside the gloves. Sweat froze on her face despite the cold. But she kept going, driven by something deeper than duty or fear. Driven by the need to prove to herself, to Harold, to the whole damn town, that she was more than they'd decided she was. She'd reset one post and was working on the second when she heard hoofbeats. Sarah's hand went to the rifle, her heart jumping. Wolves didn't ride horses, but rustlers did. And a woman alone on the open range was prey in more ways than one. The rider came over the ridge, and Sarah's fear transformed to something complicated and warm. Ethan. He dismounted before his horse fully stopped, his face tight with concern. "Sarah, what are you doing out here? It's 20 degrees and dropping." She gestured helplessly at the fence, at the tools scattered in the snow. Her hands were shaking too badly to write. Ethan took in the scene, the fallen tree, the posts she'd already set the wire waiting to be strung. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Harold's fence. Where is he?" Sarah managed to pull out her slate despite her trembling hands. "Fever. Too sick to ride. Someone had to fix it. So you came out here alone in the worst cold we've had all winter to do work that takes 2 men on a good day." It wasn't a question. Ethan shook his head, but his expression held something like admiration. "Sarah, you're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish." Maybe both, she wrote, and was surprised to see him smile. "All right then. Let's get this done before we both freeze." He stripped off his coat and went to work on the third post with the efficiency of long practice. "You start stringing wire on the posts you've set. I'll finish the digging." They worked in silence, the only sounds the strike of tools against frozen earth and the wind's constant howl. Sarah's fingers fumbled with the wire, her coordination gone to cold and exhaustion, but she kept going. Ethan reset the posts in half the time it had taken her, his movements sure and practiced. When the last wire was strung and tightened, Ethan stepped back to survey their work. "That'll hold until spring, maybe longer if we're lucky." Sarah slumped against her horse, too tired to even nod. Every muscle hurt, every breath burned. But the fence was fixed. Harold's cattle were safe. She'd done it. "Here." Ethan handed her a flask from his saddlebag. "Drink. Just a swallow, it'll warm you up." The whiskey burned going down, but it spread heat through her chest. Sarah took another small sip before handing it back. "How bad is Harold's fever?" Sarah held up her hand, wobbling it to indicate uncertainty. "Bad enough he let you ride out here instead of coming himself. That's saying something." Ethan took a drink himself. "Sarah, I'm not going to tell you your business. But a husband who sends his wife out in this cold while he stays homesick is either desperate or doesn't think much of her well-being." Sarah wanted to defend Harold, but the words wouldn't come, not because she couldn't speak them, but because they'd be lies. Harold hadn't thought about her well-being. He'd thought about his cattle, his fence, his property. She just happened to be available. "Come on," Ethan said, swinging back into his saddle. "I'll ride back with you. Make sure you get home safe." The ride back took half the time, with Ethan leading, choosing easier paths and blocking the worst of the wind with his horse. Sarah followed in a daze of exhaustion, barely staying in the saddle. When they finally reached Harold's ranch, the sun was setting in streaks of red and gold that hurt to look at. Ethan helped her dismount, his hands steady when her legs nearly buckled. "Easy. You've got nothing left to prove today." "Thank you," Sarah whispered, and watched his eyes widen at the sound of her voice. "You can speak." "A little. Sometimes. When I'm—" She gestured vaguely, not sure how to explain that extreme emotion. terror, fury, desperation, sometimes forced words past the damage. "Well," Ethan's voice was soft. "That's something. Your voice is nice. Rough but nice." Sarah felt heat rise to her frozen cheeks. No one had called anything about her nice in a very long time. "I should check on Harold." She moved toward the house, and Ethan followed. They found Harold worse than when Sarah had left him. The fever had spiked, and he thrashed in the bed, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. Ethan took one look and swore. "He needs a doctor. This isn't something that'll pass on its own." "Town's too far," Sarah managed. "Storm's coming, look at the sky." Ethan looked, and she saw worry cross his face. The sunset wasn't beautiful, it was warning. Red sky at night might mean sailor's delight, but that particular shade of crimson meant snow coming hard and fast. "Then we treat him here." Ethan was already moving, taking charge in a way that should have bothered Sarah, but instead felt like relief. "You know anything about nursing?" Sarah nodded. She'd helped care for her mother during the fever that eventually took her. She knew about cool cloths and hydration and watching for the moment when fever broke or took someone past the point of return. "Good. I'll get Snow to melt for water. You see if there's any willow bark or feverfew in the house. Anything to bring down his temperature." They worked through the night like soldiers in a war against death. Sarah sponged Harold's burning skin, while Ethan brewed remedies from what little they could find. Harold raved in his delirium, seeing things that weren't there, calling for Margaret, apologizing for sins Sarah couldn't parse. "I'm sorry," he muttered sometime past midnight. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I let you die alone. Margaret, I'm so sorry." Sarah felt something twist in her chest. This man who'd been so cold to her was drowning in guilt over a wife he'd loved and lost. How much of his cruelty was grief turned outward? How much was self-hatred made manifest? It didn't excuse his treatment of her, but it explained it. Near dawn, Harold's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes clear for the first time in days and found Sarah sitting beside his bed. Ethan had gone to tend the horses and check the storm's progress. "You stayed." Harold's voice was weak, confused. Sarah nodded. "The fence." "Fixed," she whispered. Harold closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. "I would have died out there. If you hadn't gone, if you hadn't fixed it, I would have ridden out sick and died in the snow, and you would have been free of me." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. It was true she'd thought the same thing when she'd found him fevered in the kitchen. Freedom was one fallen man away. But she'd chosen differently. "Why?" Harold asked. "After everything I've said to you, everything I've done, why did you save me?" Sarah pulled out her slate, her hands steadier now than they'd been in weeks. "Because I'm not you. Because kindness shouldn't depend on how we're treated. Because everyone deserves a second chance." Harold read the words slowly, his jaw working. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Probably not." Sarah wrote, "But I need to give it anyway. For my sake, not yours." Something broke in Harold's expression, then not softening exactly but cracking. The hard shell of bitterness showing fault lines. "I loved her," he said quietly. "Margaret. I loved her so much it made me stupid. When she died, I blamed myself. Should have gotten the doctor sooner, should have known the baby was coming wrong, should have—" His voice failed. Sarah waited. "I thought marrying again would fix it. Thought a new wife would help me forget. But you're not Margaret, and I've been punishing you for that." Harold turned his face away. "I've been a bastard." "Yes," Sarah wrote simply. Harold's laugh was bitter but genuine. "At least you're honest." He looked at her again. "I can't promise I'll be different. I've been angry so long I don't know how to be anything else. But I can try. If you're willing to stay, I can try to be less of a bastard." It wasn't much of an apology. It wasn't even really an apology at all. But it was acknowledgement, and that was more than Sarah had expected. "I'll stay," she wrote, "but things have to change." "Like what?" Sarah wrote quickly, the words she'd been holding back for weeks pouring out. You treat me like a person. You don't mock my scars or my silence. You don't come home drunk and cruel. You let me go to the ladies' aid meetings. You stop trying to control every moment of my life. Harold read the list, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. All right. That's fair. More than fair, probably. Ethan appeared in the doorway, then snow dusting his shoulders. Storm's here. I'm snowed in unless I want to risk it, and my horse is too tired to try. Stay, Harold said. It came out more command than invitation, but he added, Please, you've helped enough. Least I can do is offer you a bed and breakfast. Ethan glanced at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. Having Ethan in the house felt safe, like a buffer against the possibility that Harold's fever-induced clarity would disappear with his illness. I'll take the couch, Ethan said, and I'll be gone soon as the storm breaks. But the storm didn't break. It raged for 3 days, trapping them all in the ranch house with nothing but each other for company. Strange days, awkward at first, where Harold stayed mostly in bed recovering, and Ethan helped Sarah with the endless work of keeping a ranch running in winter. They fed the animals together, hauled water, chopped wood. Ethan taught Sarah things Harold had never bothered to explain: how to read weather signs, how to check horses for injury, how to keep meat frozen in the smokehouse without attracting predators. And they talked, or rather Ethan talked, and Sarah wrote, and somehow it felt more like real conversation than anything she'd had since the fire. My wife's name was Catherine, Ethan said one afternoon while they were stacking wood. Met her in Santa Fe. She was a teacher, came west to bring education to mining towns. Bravest woman I ever knew. How did she die? Sarah wrote. Cholera. Swept through 6 years back. Took her in 3 days. Ethan's hands stilled on the wood. I've never forgotten her, but I've made peace with it. She wouldn't want me living in the past. Do you get lonely? Sometimes. Most times, if I'm honest. He looked at Sarah with those gray eyes that saw too much. But loneliness is different from being alone. I'm alone by choice. You're lonely by circumstance. That's worse. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. He'd understood what Harold never had, that isolation forced on someone was a kind of violence. Sarah, Ethan's voice was gentle. Can I ask what happened? The fire that took your voice. She'd never written it out in full, had never trusted anyone enough to share the whole truth. But here in the barn, with snow falling soft outside, and Ethan's patient face waiting, Sarah found herself putting chalk to slate. I was an actress in Atlanta. Boarding house caught fire during the night. I tried to wake everyone, screamed until my voice gave out. Smoke damaged my throat. 4 people died. I lived. And people blamed you. Some thought I started it. Others just thought I should have saved them. You did save them, Ethan said firmly. You tried with everything you had. Their deaths aren't your fault. Then why can't I believe that? Because guilt is easier than grief. Guilt says you had control. You made choices you could have done differently. Grief means accepting that sometimes terrible things just happen and we're powerless to stop them. Ethan's voice carried the weight of experience. I blamed myself for months after Catherine died. Thought if I'd just gotten the doctor sooner, boiled the water more carefully, prayed harder, but she still would have died. The cholera didn't care about my efforts. Sarah wiped her eyes, smudging chalk across her face. Ethan handed her his handkerchief without comment. The fire took your voice, he continued, but it didn't take your worth. And any man or town that can't see that is blind. That night, Sarah made dinner for 3. They ate together at the kitchen table, an awkward triangle of people trying to navigate new territory. Harold was subdued, still weak from fever, but he watched Sarah with something new in his eyes. Not affection that would take time if it came at all, but respect. The fence held through the storm, Ethan reported. Checked it this morning. Good work. Harold's eyes slid to Sarah. You did most of it, I hear. She reset 2 posts before I got there. Ethan confirmed. "In 20-degree weather with wind that would have knocked most men down. Your wife is stronger than she looks." Something passed between the two men, understanding maybe, or warning. Harold nodded slowly. "I'm learning that." After dinner, Harold retired early, still recovering. Ethan helped Sarah with dishes, their movements comfortable and practiced, after 3 days of working together. "I should head out tomorrow if the weather holds," Ethan said. "Don't want to overstay my welcome." Sarah wrote, "You're always welcome." "Careful, Sarah. People will talk." "Let them." Ethan smiled at that, a real smile that changed his whole face. "You're getting brave. I like it." That night, lying in her cold room, Sarah thought about bravery and kindness and the strange turns life took. 3 days ago, she'd have said her marriage was hopeless, that Harold would never see her as anything but damaged goods, that she'd spend the rest of her life as isolated and miserable as she'd been since arriving. Now Harold had promised to try. Ethan had become something like a friend. And Sarah had discovered that she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had imagined. The storm had trapped them together, but it had also cracked something open. Whether that opening would lead to healing or just more pain, Sarah didn't know. But for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach into hostile snow, she felt something dangerous and fragile unfurling in her chest. Hope. Hope lasted exactly 1 week. Harold kept his promise at first. He thanked Sarah for meals, stopped making comments about her scars, even asked how her day had been, though he still didn't wait for her to write answers. But gratitude wasn't the same as change, and a week of courtesy couldn't undo months of contempt. The real problem started when people in town noticed the shift. Sarah was at the general store picking up supplies when she overheard Mrs. Calloway talking to the shopkeeper. "I saw Ethan Carter leaving the Mackenzie Ranch 3 mornings in a row during that storm. 3 mornings. And Harold laid up sick in bed the whole time." Her voice carried that particular tone of righteous scandal. Makes a person wonder what was happening under that roof. Now Clara, Ethan's a respectable man, probably just helping with chores. Respectable men don't spend 3 nights alone with another man's wife. And that Sarah, well, we all know she's damaged. Maybe damaged in the morals department too. Sarah's hands froze on the bolt of fabric she'd been examining. The shopkeeper had the grace to look embarrassed when he noticed her standing there. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I didn't see you. Clara here was just speaking truth." Mrs. Calloway turned to face Sarah directly, her eyes hard. "You may have fooled some people with your helpless act, but I know your kind. Coming here with nothing, trapping a decent man into marriage, then carrying on with his neighbor the moment his back is turned." Sarah's hand went to her slate, but Mrs. Calloway knocked it from her grasp. The slate hit the floor and cracked clean through. "Don't bother with your lies. Everyone knows what you are." Emma Wilson appeared from the back of the store, her face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Clara. You're way out of line." "I'm out of line. This woman is making a mockery of marriage and you're defending her. This woman nursed Harold through fever and fixed his fence in a blizzard, while you sat in your warm house gossiping. If anyone's making a mockery of Christian behavior, it's you." Mrs. Calloway drew herself up. "Well, I can see where your loyalties lie, Emma Wilson. Your father will hear about this." She swept out in a rustle of indignation. Emma knelt to pick up Sarah's broken slate, her hands gentle as she gathered the pieces. "I'm sorry. She's a vicious old bat." Emma pressed the pieces into Sarah's hands. "Don't let her poison get in you." But the poison was already spreading. By Sunday, the whole town seemed to know that Ethan had stayed at the Mackenzie Ranch during the storm. The whispers followed Sarah into church like ghosts. Shameless. Poor Harold, didn't he suffer enough with Margaret? I heard she can't speak because she's hiding something. Guilty conscience makes you mute, my grandmother always said. Sarah sat beside Harold in their usual pew and felt his body go rigid as he registered the stares and whispers. His jaw worked, tension radiating off him like heat. After the service, as they walked to the wagon, Deputy Mills intercepted them. "Harold, got a minute?" Harold's hand tightened on Sarah's arm. "What is it, Tom?" "Just wanted to say, well, folks are talking. And I know talk is just talk, but maybe it'd be best if Ethan Carter didn't visit your ranch quite so often. For appearance's sake. Ethan helped save my life and my fence. What he does on his own time is his business." Sure. I'm just saying, man's got a reputation to protect. Wife's got a reputation to protect. Might be wise to be more careful." Harold's face went dark. "My wife's reputation is spotless. Anyone who says different can say it to my face." Tom held up his hands. "No offense meant, just passing along friendly advice." He walked away, leaving Harold vibrating with fury. Sarah touched his arm, trying to convey gratitude, but Harold shook her off. "Get in the wagon." The ride home was silent and terrible. Sarah could feel Harold's anger building like a storm, and she knew with sick certainty that it would break over her head eventually. It came that night after supper. Harold had been drinking not heavily, but enough to loosen the fragile control he'd maintained all week. "Do you know what they're saying in town? Do you have any idea what you've done to my reputation?" Sarah reached for her slate, then remembered it was broken. She gestured helplessly, trying to communicate that she'd done nothing wrong, that Ethan had been a perfect gentleman, that the town's gossip wasn't her fault. "Don't." Harold's voice was ice. "Don't pretend you're innocent. You encouraged him. All those times he came by with gifts, with firewood, with his sad eyes and pretty words, you let him court you right under my nose." Sarah shook her head frantically. Ethan had been kind, nothing more. She'd never encouraged anything improper. She'd been grateful for friendship in a place where everyone else saw her as cursed. "I defended you," Harold continued, his voice rising. "I stood up to the whole damn town and said my wife was respectable, and now I look like a fool. A cuckolded fool with a mute wife who spreads her legs for the first man who shows her kindness." The words hit like fists. Sarah stumbled back, her hand pressed to her throat. "That's what they're saying, Sarah. That's what everyone in Winter Creek believes. That you're a whore who can't even speak her sins." Harold moved closer, and Sarah saw something dangerous in his eyes. Not just anger, but wounded pride. The same pride that had made him defend her in public, even while despising her in private. "I want you to stay away from Ethan Carter. I don't care if the barn is burning down, and he's the only one with water. You don't speak to him, you don't accept his help, you don't even look at him. Understood?" Sarah's hands moved, trying to explain, trying to defend herself, but Harold grabbed her wrists. "I said, do you understand?" The fear that shot through Sarah was sharp and immediate. This was the moment she'd been dreading since the wedding, the moment Harold's control finally snapped. She could see it in his face, the desire to hurt her, to make her feel as small and worthless as the town's gossip had made him feel. She nodded, going limp in his grip. Harold released her with a sound of disgust. "Get out of my sight." Sarah ran. Up the stairs to her room, slamming the door and dragging the chair under the handle. She sat on her bed, shaking, pressing both hands to her mouth to keep silent sobs from escaping. This was her life. This was what she'd chosen when she signed that marriage certificate. A man who saw her as property, a town that saw her as immoral, and no voice to defend herself with. She thought of Ruth's offer. The room behind the dress shop, sanctuary. But leaving would confirm everything Mrs. Calloway and the others believed. Would prove she was weak, broken, incapable of being a proper wife. Would give the gossips more ammunition and Harold more reasons to hate her. Sarah pulled Margaret's quilt around her shoulders and stared out at the frozen night. Somewhere beyond the mountains, there had to be a place where scarred women could live without shame, where silence wasn't seen as guilt, where kindness didn't come with conditions or consequences. But she had no way to reach it. No money, no voice, no power to change her circumstances. She was trapped, and the trap was tightening. The next morning, Harold was gone before Sarah woke. He'd left a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to Denver on business. Back in 2 weeks. Don't burn the house down." 2 weeks alone. Sarah should have felt relieved, but instead she felt abandoned. Left to face the town's judgment without even Harold's grudging presence as protection. She threw herself into work, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, mending clothes that barely needed mending, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling. But the isolation pressed in like the cold, and by the third day, Sarah was talking to the chickens just to hear something besides her own thoughts. On the fourth day, Ethan rode up. Sarah saw him coming and felt panic and longing war in her chest. She wanted to run to him to pour out everything that had happened, to accept the comfort he'd offered. But Harold's words echoed. You don't speak to him. You don't accept his help. You don't even look at him. She stayed inside, watching through the window as Ethan dismounted and approached the house. His knock was gentle but firm. Sarah, I know you're in there. I saw smoke from the chimney. She pressed against the wall beside the door, not answering. Sarah, I heard what they're saying in town. I know Harold blamed you. I came to tell you, it's not your fault. None of it is your fault. Sarah closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. I'm going to leave some supplies on the porch, firewood and food. I won't bother you again if you don't want me to. But Sarah, if you need help, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me. She heard him moving, heard the thud of wood being stacked and the rustle of packages being set down, then hoofbeats fading into the distance. When she finally opened the door, she found everything he'd promised. Plus one more thing, a book wrapped in oilcloth with a note tucked inside. For the long nights. Poetry helped me through the worst of my grief. Maybe it'll help you too. You're stronger than they know. Stronger than you know. E. Sarah sank onto the porch step, clutching the book to her chest, and wept for the friendship she'd lost before she'd fully understood she had it. The next Sunday, Sarah forced herself to attend church alone. She needed supplies from town, and hiding would only feed the gossip. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She'd survived worse than small-minded cruelty, but she hadn't counted on them confronting her directly. She was leaving the general store when a group of women blocked her path. Mrs. Calloway led them, her face set in righteous judgment. We've been talking, Sarah Mackenzie, and we've decided something needs to be said. Sarah's hand went to her broken slate, still in her pocket, useless. You came to this town under false pretenses. You trapped Harold into marriage, then shamed him with your behavior. We're Christian women, and we believe in forgiveness, but we also believe in consequences. Emma Wilson pushed through the crowd. What the hell are you doing, Clara? Protecting this community's morals. This woman is a corrupting influence. This woman fixed Harold's fence in a blizzard while he was too sick to do it himself. This woman has done nothing wrong except survive things that would have broken any of you. You always were too soft on sinners, Emma, just like your father. And you've always been a bitter old woman who tears down others to feel better about yourself. Emma turned to Sarah. Come on, let's get you home. But Mrs. Calloway wasn't finished. Mark my words, Sarah Mackenzie. God sees everything. He knows what you are. And judgment comes for sinners, whether they can speak or not. The words followed Sarah all the way back to the ranch. God sees everything. He knows what you are. What was she, a woman who'd survived a fire? A woman who'd married for survival? A woman who'd dared to accept kindness from a widower who reminded her that humanity still existed? Were those sins? Was surviving a sin? Was accepting help a sin? Or was the real sin in how the town treated her with suspicion and cruelty, and a complete absence of the Christian charity they claimed to value? That night, Sarah opened Ethan's book of poetry. The pages were worn clearly, read many times. Some passages were marked with careful notes in the margins, Catherine's handwriting, Sarah guessed. A dead woman's thoughts on love and loss. One poem stopped her cold. They told me I was nothing because my voice was gone. But silence taught me listening, and listening made me strong. Someone Catherine or Ethan had written beside it. For the days when the world is too loud. Sarah traced the words with her finger, feeling connection to a woman she'd never met. Catherine had understood, had known what it meant to be dismissed, to find strength in unexpected places. She pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. Not on her broken slate where words disappeared with a swipe of cloth. Real writing that would last. She wrote about the fire, about Atlanta, about every moment of fear and shame since. She wrote about Harold's cruelty and his brief kindness, and his return to anger. She wrote about the town's judgment, and Mrs. Calloway's venom, and the way Emma and Ruth and Ethan had shown her that not everyone was cruel. She wrote until her hand cramped and the lamp burned low, and the words had poured out like poison being drained from a wound. Then she folded the pages carefully and tucked them into her mother's Bible. Not to send to anyone, not to show anyone, just to have them exist outside her own head, proof that her story was real even if no one else would hear it. Harold returned from Denver, changed. Not softened. Harold would never be soft, but quieter, more careful. He brought Sarah a new slate, this one bound in leather with proper chalk that didn't crumble. "I did some thinking while I was gone," he said, handing it to her. "About Margaret and you and the man I've become since she died." Sarah weighted the new slate smooth and heavy in her hands. "I'm not going to pretend I'm suddenly a good husband. I'm not. I'm angry and bitter, and I take it out on people who don't deserve it." He poured himself coffee with shaking hands. "But Margaret wouldn't recognize what I've turned into. She'd be ashamed of me." He sat at the table, suddenly looking older than his years. "I can't love you, Sarah. I don't have that in me anymore. But I can try to not hate you for things that aren't your fault. That's the best I can offer." It wasn't much. It wasn't even close to what a marriage should be. But it was honest, and honesty was something Sarah could work with. She wrote on her new slate, "That's enough for now. The town's going to keep talking. I can't stop that." "I know. And I still don't want Ethan Carter sniffing around my property." Sarah's hand tightened on her chalk, but she nodded. That battle wasn't worth fighting yet. "But," Harold took a breath, "if you want to go to the ladies' aid meetings or Ruth's shop or wherever women go, you can. I won't stop you." "Thank you," Sarah wrote and meant it. They settled into a new pattern over the following weeks. Not comfortable, but livable. Harold worked his ranch and came home tired rather than drunk most nights. Sarah managed the house and attended her meetings and slowly built a life that was hers, even if it existed in the margins of Harold's. At the Ladies' Aid Society, Emma announced she was engaged to a rancher from the next county. The women celebrated, and Sarah felt genuine happiness for her friend. Emma deserved joy. "You'll come to the wedding?" Emma asked. "It's in May, after the thaw." Sarah nodded, already imagining the dress she could make, the gift she could craft. Ruth pulled her aside after the meeting. "How are you really doing, and don't just nod, write it down." Sarah wrote honestly, "Better than I was. Not as good as I hoped to be." "That's fair. And Ethan, I heard Harold forbid you to see him." "Harold's right to be careful. The town already believes the worst. The town's full of idiots, but I understand." Ruth squeezed Sarah's hand. "Just know the offer stands. My back room is always available if you need it. You've been kind to me." Why, Ruth smiled, sad and knowing. "Because I was you once. Different circumstances, but the same isolation, the same judgment. An older woman helped me survive it. Now I pass it forward." That night, Sarah thought about chains of kindness stretching backward through time. Catherine teaching Ethan compassion. Ruth extending sanctuary to desperate women. Emma defending outsiders against the town's cruelty. Each act of grace creating ripples that touched lives years later. Maybe that's what survival meant. Not just enduring, but passing along the kindness that kept you alive, lighting lamps for people still stumbling through darkness. Sarah pulled out the pages she'd written, her testimony, her truth, and added a new section. Not about pain this time, but about the people who'd helped. Martha, who'd sheltered her after the church social. Emma, who'd offered a horse. Ruth, who'd defended her. Ethan, who'd seen her as human when everyone else saw her as cursed. These were her witnesses. Not to the fire that took her voice, but to the slow rebuilding that came after. She was still writing when she heard hoofbeats. Late for visitors past 9 o'clock. Sarah went to the window and saw a horse ridden hard, its rider slumped in the saddle. She grabbed Harold's rifle and opened the door carefully. The rider nearly fell dismounting. In the moonlight, Sarah recognized him. Ethan. Blood soaked his shirt. His face was gray with pain. Sarah dropped the rifle and ran to him, catching him as his legs gave out. He was heavy dead weight against her, but she managed to get him to the porch. "Sorry," he gasped. "Nowhere else to go. Harold is Harold here." Sarah shook her head. Harold had ridden to check the North Range and wouldn't be back until morning. "Good. Don't want to cause more trouble." Ethan's head lolled. "Rustlers. Caught them on my land. They shot me. I shot back. Think I killed one." Sarah's hands moved frantically, trying to assess the damage. The bullet had gone through his shoulder, missing anything vital but bleeding heavily. She needed to stop the bleeding, clean the wound, get him inside where it was warm. She managed to half-carry, half-drag him into the house and onto the couch. He was conscious, but fading shock setting in from blood loss and cold. Sarah worked with steady hands, despite her terror, doing everything she'd learned nursing Harold through fever. Hot water and clean cloth. Whiskey for disinfecting and pain. Bandages torn from an old sheet. Ethan hissed when she poured whiskey into the wound, but his hand found hers and squeezed. "You're good at this," he managed. "Wasted as a ranch wife. Should have been a nurse." Sarah wanted to tell him she'd thought the same thing, that before the fire she'd considered training as a nurse instead of pursuing theater. But her hands were busy, and her voice was locked away again, retreated in the face of crisis. She finished bandaging and covered him with quilts. His color was better now the bleeding stopped. He'd live if infection didn't set in. "Can't stay here," Ethan said. "Harold finds me here after everything." Sarah put her hand over his mouth, shaking her head firmly. He was in no condition to ride, and she wouldn't send an injured man into the night to protect Harold's pride or the town's opinion. Some things mattered more than reputation. "Stubborn woman," Ethan muttered, but his eyes were already closing. "Catherine would have liked you." He slept, and Sarah sat beside him through the night, changing bandages when blood seeped through, checking his fever, keeping watch like she'd kept watch over Harold weeks before. This was who she was, she realized. Not the cursed creature the town imagined. Not the damaged goods Harold had married. She was a woman who'd survived fire and learned to nurse the wounded. A woman who chose kindness over self-preservation. A woman with no voice but endless strength. Dawn broke cold and clear. Harold would be home soon. Sarah would face his fury, the town's renewed judgment, the consequences of choosing compassion over obedience. But looking at Ethan sleeping fitfully on her couch alive because she'd refused to turn him away, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months. Pride. She'd saved him. Just like she'd saved Harold. Just like she'd tried to save the people in Atlanta, even though she'd failed. This time, she'd succeeded. And that had to count for something. Harold's hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Sarah straightened her spine and prepared to fight for the choice she'd made. Whatever came next, she would face it. She'd survived worse, with less. And she was done apologizing for refusing to let people die. Harold stood in the doorway, snow melting on his boots, taking in the scene with eyes that went from confusion to cold fury in the space of a heartbeat. Sarah rose from the chair beside Ethan's sleeping form, her slate already in her hand, though her fingers trembled. "What the hell is this?" Sarah wrote quickly. He was shot. Rustlers on his land. He needed help. Harold's jaw worked as he read the words. "So you brought him here, into my house, after everything I said about staying away from him." He would have died. Maybe he should have. Harold's voice was low, dangerous. Maybe that would have solved all our problems. Ethan stirred at the sound, his eyes opening with difficulty. "Harold, don't blame her. I rode here because it was closest. Didn't know you were gone. How convenient." Harold moved into the room, and Sarah instinctively stepped between him and the couch. Harold stopped, something flickering across his face at her protective stance. "Get out of my way, Sarah." She shook her head, holding her ground. The rifle was still by the door where she'd dropped it too far to reach. But she had her body and her will, and right now, that had to be enough. "You're defending him. Over me. Your husband." Harold's voice cracked on the last word. "This is what it's come to. You care more about him than—" "She doesn't care about me that way, and you damn well know it." Ethan's voice was weak but firm. "She's a decent human being who doesn't let people bleed to death on her porch. That's all this is." "That's all?" Harold laughed, bitter and harsh. "The whole town thinks you're lovers. Every person in Winter Creek has an opinion about my wife's virtue, and you think this?" He gestured at the blood-stained couch. "The intimate scene of Sarah nursing Ethan through the night is going to make it better." Sarah grabbed her slate. "I don't care what the town thinks anymore. I care about doing what's right." Harold read it, and something in him seemed to break. Not his anger that still burned hot, but the rigid control he'd maintained since Denver. "What's right? You want to talk about what's right? I told you to stay away from him. I gave you one goddamn rule, Sarah. One boundary. And you couldn't even manage that." "Some rules are worth breaking," she wrote, her hand steady, despite her racing heart. "Get out." Harold's voice was quiet now, which was somehow worse than shouting. "Both of you, get the hell off my property." Ethan tried to sit up, grimacing with pain. "Harold, be reasonable. I can't ride like this. Give me a day to recover and I'll go. Sarah's done nothing wrong." "She's done everything wrong. From the moment she stepped off that stage, she's been nothing but wrong." Harold's eyes found Sarah's, and she saw something terrible in them, not just anger, but the desire to hurt her, the way the town's gossip had hurt him. "I should never have married you. Margaret was right when she told me not to send for another wife. She said no woman could replace her, and she was right. You're not a replacement. You're not even a poor substitute. You're just a broken thing I was fool enough to take in." The words landed like blows. Sarah felt each one, felt them lodge in the places she was already wounded. But she didn't back down, didn't apologize, didn't reach for her slate to write placating words. Instead, she walked to the stairs and climbed them with her head high. In her room, she pulled out her carpet bag, the same one she'd arrived with, and began packing. Her 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, the pages of testimony she'd written, Ethan's book of poetry. Everything that mattered fit in one bag, just like it had when she left Atlanta. She'd survived that departure. She'd survive this one. Downstairs, she could hear Harold and Ethan arguing in low, fierce voices. She ignored them, moving through the house one last time, gathering the few things she'd added to make it bearable. Her sewing basket, the gloves Ethan had given her, the new slate Harold had brought from Denver. She paused at Harold's door, looking into the room where she'd nursed him through fever, and listened to him call for Margaret in his delirium. Part of her wanted to feel something, regret, maybe, or loss. But all she felt was tired. Tired of fighting for scraps of dignity. Tired of apologizing for surviving. Tired of being treated like property instead of a person. When she came back downstairs, Ethan was on his feet, leaning heavily on the back of the couch. Harold stood by the cold fireplace, his face a mask of rigid control. "Sarah, you don't have to leave." Ethan's voice was strained. "This is your home. You're his wife." Sarah wrote on her slate, the chalk making soft sounds in the heavy silence. "This has never been my home, and being his wife has only meant being his servant and his shame." She turned to Harold, writing quickly. "Thank you for marrying me when I had nowhere else to go. I mean that. But I won't stay where I'm despised. I won't keep apologizing for being who I am." Harold's jaw worked. "Where will you go? You have no money, no family. Winter Creek won't take you in, not after this. Ruth offered me a room. I'll make my own way." "Doing what you can't?" Speak, Sarah. "What kind of work do you think you'll find? The same kind I've always done. Whatever it takes to survive. She picked up her bag, and Ethan moved to help, despite his injury. I'll take you to town. My horse can carry us both. The hell you will. Harold stepped forward. You can barely stand. You're in no condition to ride. Then I'll walk. Sarah whispered, her damaged voice rough but audible. I've walked harder roads than this. Both men stopped staring. Sarah realized it was the first time Harold had heard her speak. The first time he knew she could. You can talk. Harold's voice was flat with shock. All this time you could talk and you... No. Ethan cut him off. All this time she's been fighting to talk. Fighting past damage and fear and the weight of everyone telling her she's broken. Don't you dare use this against her. Harold looked between them, something crumbling in his expression. I didn't know. Sarah, I didn't know you could... It doesn't matter. Sarah's voice was barely more than a rasp, but the words were clear. Knowing wouldn't have changed how you treated me. You didn't want a wife, Harold. You wanted Margaret's ghost. And I'm sorry I couldn't be her. But I'm done trying. She walked to the door, and this time neither man tried to stop her. Outside, the morning was brutally cold, the kind of cold that killed the unprepared. Sarah had no coat heavy enough, no horse, no real plan beyond reaching town before nightfall. But she had her dignity, and that was worth freezing for. She'd made it halfway down the drive when she heard hoofbeats. Harold pulled up beside her on his gelding leading Ethan's horse. Get on. It wasn't quite an order, not quite a request. Sarah shook her head. Sarah, it's 12 miles to town and the temperature's dropping. You'll freeze before you make it halfway. He stopped, swallowed hard. I'm not so far gone that I'd let you die of stubbornness. Get on the damn horse. She studied his face looking for the trap, but all she saw was exhaustion and something that might have been shame. Please. Harold added the word, clearly costing him. Sarah took the reins of Ethan's horse, pulling herself into the saddle with movements made clumsy by cold and emotion. Harold turned his mount toward town without another word, and Sarah followed her bag across her lap and her future uncertain as the winter sky. They rode in silence, Harold slightly ahead, his shoulders rigid with tension. As they crested the ridge that overlooked Winter Creek, Sarah saw smoke rising from chimneys, saw the church steeple catching morning light, saw the town that had judged her from the moment she arrived, but she also saw Ruth's dress shop warm and welcoming, saw the livery where Emma would defend her without hesitation, saw the possibility of building a life that wasn't defined by a man's approval or a town's acceptance. Harold pulled up at the edge of town, turning to face her. I can't be what you need, Sarah. I thought I could try, but watching you defend Ethan, seeing you willing to throw everything away to help him, it made me realize something. Sarah weighted her hands tight on the reins. You're braver than I am, stronger than I am, and you deserve better than what I've given you. Harold's voice was rough. I'll tell the preacher the marriage is over. Annulment on grounds of hell, I'll figure out the grounds. You'll be free of me by spring. Sarah pulled out her slate. What will people say? Let them say whatever they want. I'm done caring what Winter Creek thinks. Harold almost smiled. You taught me that, at least. That surviving with dignity matters more than other people's opinions. He rode away before Sarah could respond, disappearing into the maze of streets that led to the church. Sarah sat for a moment, processing what had just happened. Free. By spring, she'd be free. The weight that lifted from her chest was so sudden she felt dizzy with it. She rode to Ruth's dress shop and dismounted, her legs shaky. The shop door opened before she could knock. I saw you coming. Ruth took in Sarah's carpet bag, her exhausted face, the determination in her eyes. The room's ready. Has been since the day we met. Sarah stepped inside into warmth and the smell of fabric and the safety of a woman who understood. She managed 2 words before her voice gave out entirely. Thank you. No need. Ruth took her bag, guided her to the back room where a narrow bed waited with clean quilts and a window that looked out on the mountains. Rest now. We'll figure out everything else later. Sarah sank onto the bed and let herself cry for the first time since the fire. Not silent tears, but deep wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for Atlanta and the people she couldn't save. She cried for the marriage that had failed before it started. She cried for every moment she'd felt less than human, every time someone had looked at her scars and decided her worth. And then, when the tears finally stopped, she slept. She woke to the sound of voices in the shop. Emma and Ruth talking in low tones. Is she all right? She will be. Stronger than most people I've met. She just needs time. And Harold, what's he saying? According to Reverend Davies, he's asking for an annulment. Claims the marriage was never consummated, that he misrepresented his situation, that it's best for everyone. Good. She deserves better than him. Sarah rose, smoothing her dress and running fingers through her tangled hair. When she emerged from the back room, Emma and Ruth both turned with identical expressions of relief. You're awake! Emma moved forward, then stopped uncertain. How are you feeling? Sarah pulled out her slate, like I can breathe for the first time in months. Emma's face broke into a fierce smile. Good, because we've been making plans. Over the next hour, Sarah learned that Ruth needed help in the shop, that Emma's father needed bookkeeping done at the livery, that the Ladies' Aid Society could always use seamstress work. Between the three sources of income, Sarah could support herself modestly, but independently. You'll live here, Ruth said firmly. The room's yours for as long as you want it. And before you start worrying about rent, I need the help. The shop's getting too busy for one person. Sarah wrote, I don't know how to thank you. Thank us by building a good life. That's all the thanks we need. That afternoon, Ethan appeared at the shop, still pale, but moving better. His shoulder was properly bandaged, now the doctor had seen to it that morning. I heard what happened, he said when Ruth showed him to the back room where Sarah was sorting fabric. I'm sorry. If I hadn't come to your door... Sarah shook her head, writing quickly. You saved me, giving me a reason to leave, giving me the courage to choose myself instead of Harold's pride. That's a generous interpretation. Ethan sat carefully in the chair by the window. Most people would say I ruined your marriage. You can't ruin something that was already broken. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Sarah working and Ethan watching the street outside. Finally he spoke. Catherine used to say that some people come into our lives to teach us things. Hard things usually. Harold taught you what you won't accept, what you won't tolerate. That's worth knowing. What did Catherine teach you? That love doesn't require perfection. That the best relationships are built on acceptance, not changing each other into what we think we need. He paused. And that when you find someone who sees you, really sees you scars and silence, and all you don't let them go. Sarah's hands stilled on the fabric. She looked up to find Ethan watching her with those gray eyes that had been kind from the first moment. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. You need time. You need to figure out who Sarah is when she's not defined by a husband or a town's judgment. I understand that. But when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like to know that Sarah, the real one. Sarah's throat worked. Words pushed against the damage fighting to be heard. I'd like that too, she whispered. Ethan's smile was slow and genuine. Good. Then I'll be patient. I'm good at patient. He left soon after, and Sarah returned to her work with something warm blooming in her chest. Not love, not yet anyway. But possibility. The sense that maybe, after all the loss and pain and survival, there was still room for joy. The annulment came through 6 weeks later. Harold signed the papers without protest, and Sarah became Sarah Mitchell again, no longer anyone's wife. No longer defined by a failed marriage. Free. Emma's wedding in May was a celebration that felt like rebirth. Sarah wore a dress she'd made herself, blue as a summer sky, high-necked to hide her scars, but beautiful in its simplicity. She stood with the other women and watched Emma marry her rancher with tears of genuine happiness. After the ceremony, Mrs. Calloway approached her, her face pinched with the effort of being civil. "I suppose I should apologize for the things I said. Ruth tells me I was harsh." Sarah pulled out her slate. "You were cruel, but I forgive you anyway. Carrying grudges is too heavy for either of us." Mrs. Calloway blinked, surprised by the grace she didn't deserve. "Well, thank you, I suppose." She walked away, and Emma appeared at Sarah's elbow. "You're a better person than me. I'd have told her to go to hell." "I thought about it," Sarah wrote, smiling. "But Ruth's been teaching me about taking the high road." "Ruth's a saint. Speaking of which..." Emma lowered her voice. "Ethan's been watching you all day. Just thought you should know." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. She'd been aware of Ethan's presence had caught him looking at her more than once. They'd settled into an easy friendship over the past months. He stopped by the shop regularly, always with a book to loan or a story to share, never pushing for more than Sarah was ready to give. But lately, Sarah had found herself wanting more. Wanting to hear his voice, to see his smile, to sit beside him, and talk about nothing and everything. "He's a good man," Emma continued, "and you deserve a good man after what you went through with Harold." "I'm not ready to marry again, maybe never." "Who said anything about marriage? Maybe just start with being happy, see where it leads." That night, after the dancing and celebrating had wound down, Sarah found Ethan standing by the church, looking up at the stars. "Beautiful night," he said when she approached. "Catherine always said May weddings brought the best weather." Sarah nodded, standing beside him in comfortable silence. After a moment, she pulled out her slate. "Tell me about her. Really tell me. I want to know." So Ethan did. He talked about Catherine's laugh, her love of learning, her fierce determination to bring education to places that didn't value it. He talked about their courtship, their marriage, their quiet life together. He talked about her death and his grief and the long process of learning to live again. "I loved her completely," he finished. "But she's gone, and I think she'd want me to be happy again, to find someone who makes life feel less like survival and more like living." Sarah's hands shook as she wrote, "I'm still learning the difference." "I know, but you're getting there. I see it in you, the way you smile more now, the way you stand straighter, the way you look at the future like it might hold something good instead of just more pain. You helped with that. You and Ruth and Emma. You all showed me that kindness still exists." Sarah. Ethan turned to face her fully. "I know it's too soon. I know you need time, but I need you to know something. When I look at you, I don't see scars. I don't see silence. I see a woman who survived fire and came out stronger. I see someone who chose compassion over bitterness, who saved lives even when it cost her, who refused to be less than she was, just to make small people comfortable." Sarah felt tears welling up. Good tears for once. "I see someone I could love," Ethan continued quietly. "If she'd let me. Someday. When she's ready." Sarah set down her slate and reached for his hand. Her voice, rough from disuse but growing stronger with practice, whispered into the spring night, "Someday soon." Ethan's smile was brighter than the stars. He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "I can wait for soon. I've waited this long." They stood together in the darkness, two people who'd survived loss and found each other on the other side. Sarah felt the last pieces of her old life falling away, the shame, the fear, the sense that she was somehow less because of what the fire had taken. In their place grew something new. Not the loud, dramatic happiness of romance novels. Something quieter, steadier. The kind of joy that came from knowing yourself, accepting yourself, and finding someone who loved you, not despite your scars, but including them. A year later, Sarah and Ethan married in the same church where she'd wed Harold in desperation and fear. But this ceremony was different in every way that mattered. Sarah wore blue instead of gray. She spoke her vows in her rough, precious voice instead of silent nods. And when Ethan kissed her, she felt only joy. Ruth stood as her witness, beaming with pride. Emma held flowers from her own garden. Even Harold attended, sitting in the back, his face holding something that might have been regret or acceptance, or both. After the ceremony, he approached Sarah with careful steps. "I owe you an apology. A real one, not the half-hearted thing I gave before." Harold's voice was quiet. "I treated you terribly. Used you as a target for grief that had nothing to do with you. You deserved better." Sarah considered him this man who'd hurt her, who'd also inadvertently freed her. "Thank you," she said simply. "I forgive you. I don't deserve it." "Probably not, but I need to give it anyway." Sarah smiled slightly. "For my sake, not yours." Harold almost laughed, recognizing his own words. "You were always stronger than I gave you credit for. Ethan's a lucky man." "I'm a lucky woman." Harold tipped his hat and walked away, and Sarah felt the last thread of bitterness snap. She was free of him in every way that mattered, legally, emotionally, spiritually. Ethan appeared at her side, offering his arm. "Ready to start our life together." Sarah took his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had seen her through her darkest moments. "I've been ready since the day you first showed me kindness," she whispered. They left the church together, stepping into spring sunshine that felt like blessing. Around them, the town watched with expressions ranging from approval to lingering judgment. But Sarah didn't care anymore. Let them think what they wanted. She knew her own worth. She'd survived fire that stole her voice, survived a marriage that tried to steal her dignity, survived a town that wanted to steal her hope. And on the other side of all that survival, she'd found something better than she'd dared imagine: love that accepted her completely, community that defended her fiercely, and most importantly, herself. Sarah Mitchell. Carter, no longer silent, no longer ashamed, no longer broken, had finally come home. Not to a place, but to the knowledge that she was enough exactly as she was. Scars and rough voice and hard-won strength included. And that was worth more than all the perfect words she'd ever lost.